Thank you very much for coming onto the podcast today, Danny. I'm excited to have you on because I guess, as I mentioned to you when I was talking to you on Instagram, you're the very first podcast I ever listened to. So, to have you come on my podcast now is a full circle moment for me. So, do you want to give people a little bit of an idea as to who you are, your background, and I guess you have a little bit of authority now to be speaking on the topic of nutrition today.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for the invitation and thanks for the kind words. That's cool that the podcast was something that you enjoyed. So yeah, in short, I have a company called Sigma Nutrition, which basically tries to put out evidence-based information about nutrition science, mainly aimed at, I would say, people who are working as nutrition or health professionals, or people who are at a pretty intermediate to advanced level of understanding already of nutrition that want to dig in more to the science, looking at the research behind it. So looking at the methodologies in certain studies or what we know about a certain topic by referencing research. That has mainly been done through the podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio. So I've been doing that for nearly 11 years now. And so I was kind of lucky to get in on the podcast train before it took off a few years ago. And apart from that, there's other things like articles, presentations, and so on. For a number of years, I was working as a nutrition practitioner, but over the last number of years, mainly all I've been doing is looking at nutrition content. So spending my time looking and reading research, creating podcasts and interviewing researchers about that. So that is, in short, what Sigma Nutrition is about. But happy to get into any of the other parts of the backstory. So in short, did a master's degree in nutritional science, and off the back of that started talking about nutrition on the internet and kind of led to what is now the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you probably an off the wall question, but the podcast game now, right? Anybody can get Spotify for creators and order a microphone on the internet for £100. What was it like when you actually started a podcast originally? I was thinking, how the fuck did people even upload podcasts back then?
Yeah, it was certainly more complicated. That there was a few working parts as opposed to just now you can get a one-stop solution, I think, and to start and get everything set up. But I mean, there were still YouTube tutorials about how to go about setting it up, but it was just a bit more manual effort. The main thing was, at the time, and again, there were still people that were listening to podcasts, but it still wasn't anywhere near as popular as it was now. Even the terminology around it, and getting people aware of, here's where you go to listen to podcasts, here's where you can find this thing, and here's exactly what it is. There was a bit of that kind of barrier, at least for the first couple of years. But then I suppose certainly around 2017 is when podcasts, I think, really started to pick up more and more popularity. And then around that time, they were kind of really booming. But certainly early on, it was more complicated to put it together. And I suppose from my perspective, getting people to talk to, in general, people are pretty happy to talk about their work. But there was just more of that kind of education part of, hey, I've got this podcast, here's what it is, and here's how we do it. And do you want to come and talk about your research? And so, whereas now, basically every researcher knows what a podcast is and is happy to do them and can see that, oh, this is going to reach X number of people. Whereas at the start, I didn't have any of that information to give people. So yeah, it was certainly a bit more manual, but made it work.
Yeah, it's not like you were just trying to get a free consultation for an hour.
Right. And that's what I think a lot of it came across as sometimes. And because I think initially there was certainly more of that, of people saying, okay, what's the deal with this? Is there do I get paid for this? Is this like a media appearance on TV? Or a lot of them being used to doing a spot on the radio, for example, but that might be a 3-4 minute segment where they have to condense their work into these quick, snappy answers. And so that wasn't all the time, but certainly a few times that did happen, yeah.
And I guess just to kind of follow on for this, before we get into the main topic of today, how have your interviewing skills progressed from where you started? What would you say are probably the most important things that you've kind of learned from podcasting for the last 7 years in regards to asking good questions and maybe I guess still trying to stay true to the values of the podcast, because I know like the at the core of like Sigma has always been like the kind of evidence based kind of practice, right? And how have you,
Yeah.
as you say, with that, considering so many podcasts now go down the route of sensationalism?
Mm. On the actual interviewing side, I think for me, I think the temptation early on for anyone, because we're always going to be quite nervous starting something and we want to do a good job, and that maybe tends to overthink ahead of time what we would like to ask or how we might phrase something. Sometimes people even take that step further and have specific things scripted out, which personally I don't think really works well. It actually ends up being more distracting for an interviewer if they have specific questions they have to try and read off. Most times you can tell if someone's reading word for word something off a script. So instead, having a general guideline is good. And I think relying more on having done sufficient preparation around the topic you want to talk about, being generally curious about it, and then just when the interview starts, just getting on with having a normal conversation, just listening to what that person said. And so I think probably the main thing that I would say I do more now that ends up leading to a better interview is the kind of cliche of like being present in that interview, of like I'm actually doing active listening and responding to what that person is saying, and then thinking on the fly of questions that come up. But of course, the preparation we've done beforehand is going to feed into what is likely going to come to my mind when they say something. And I still have points that I want to hit on, and those are going to naturally come up. But certainly relying on that, I've done enough preparation beforehand, and now I can relax and just actually listen to what this person is saying. I think that works really well. And then the other thing is actually trying to prepare to a point where I understand some of the things that this person talks about. So if I'm interviewing a researcher on whatever topic, I'm never going to be an expert in that specific domain, but at least having read some of their background work or having an understanding of what things I would be curious to ask them about, as opposed to just give really too generic questions of like, oh, so tell me, how do people lose weight? Like, it's kind of a pointless question, because it's too difficult for someone to start to answer, because they have to do all the legwork, right? They have to start, where do you want me to start with that question? And so, yeah, I think having sufficient preparation and just asking things that I'm generally curious about, and then hoping that enough people in the audience are also thinking those same things.
Yeah, I definitely think the active listening component is something that I've become very, very aware of. Like the more I've done these, so like this is my individual podcast, and I was running a podcast with my friend as well for a few years before then, and I would always try to like over prepare for guests coming on, like, you know, too many questions, and then I have like things that I am trying to hold in my brain that I want to speak on while the person's still talking. So I like miss some of the points that they're making, and they'd be like, it's kind of like the game of tennis. Like, you're letting one person take a point, and then you're kind of spewing out your own, whereas you're not really kind of following everything that the person is saying. And I guess with that, it's meant to be a conversation, right? It's like meant to, like, obviously you have things that you want to address through the conversation, through the actual podcast, but overthinking it to the point of it becoming more of an interview than something that flows nicely. Like, again, as you said, like, you can kind of tell when something's scripted and it just doesn't flow naturally, and it just seems a bit weird.
Yeah, and certainly there's that maybe temptation early on, and I certainly can see it in different examples that come to mind, where because we obviously have a sufficient amount of knowledge on a certain topic, because it's the thing we're most interested in, because we want to talk to people, it's our work, there's sometimes that temptation early on to demonstrate that to the audience. And so after someone says something, we want to fill in or give our opinion on it to the point of like, let me show the audience that I also know this. Or that can also have the other problem of starting with a question that is too advanced, so you haven't given enough backstory because you're already starting from a certain level of knowledge. And so I think for me, it's been having the capacity to ask questions that in general I know more or less the answer per se, but it's important to have those questions at the early part of the interview to get us into the more interesting stuff later on, and not trying to demonstrate, oh, well, I already know this, and regurgitating a bunch of things, and then the interviewer says, yeah, that's right. But like, no one wants to hear that. So it's mainly me staying out of the way as much as possible, as opposed to trying to be the protagonist. I think tends to lead to the best result.
Yeah, leave the expertise to the expert. But I guess you kind of could be a good segue into what we're going to talk about now, because as I kind of mentioned to you, I want to talk about like healthy diets. What is a healthy diet, and all the components of that. And I guess diet is like eating is something all of us do every single day, but there is lots of good information, bad information, and just confusion around like dietary practices. So to start us off with this conversation, Danny, how would you define a healthy diet?
Well, there's a few different routes we could go with this. And I think if I'm giving my personal kind of overview of how I tend to get people to think of it, is there's obviously the component that we first think is a physical health aspect, which of course is key, right? There's then the immediate provision of certain nutrients and energy, which is the most direct thing that a diet is providing, i.e., is it providing us with sufficient energy, micronutrients, macronutrients in order to fulfill our biological processes that we need to in order to, number one, survive, and then second to that, to maintain robust health. So are we getting enough nutrients to avoid an outright deficiency that would lead to a condition, or that would set the stage maybe for later disease? So there's that direct component. There's then another layer on top of that, which relates to, I suppose, the psychology around how diets fit into our lifestyle. And so the consequences of eating in a certain way, is that going to affect us psychologically? And this gets us into areas like of how restrictive a certain dietary practice is, how difficult that dietary practice is to adhere to. Does that have consequences for how we live our lives in terms of social interactions and so on? I think they're important to consider, these kind of secondary knock-on effects. And then there's also social aspects and cultural aspects to diet, which are also important, that I think do tie into a larger aspect related to health. So maybe not directly, but they're certainly indirectly. If we are trying to eat in a certain way or receiving recommendations that don't fit in with certain cultural values or personal values and so on, that makes it very difficult for that person to have an overall global good health, let's say, based on some of the things they're doing with their diet. So there's all these different layers, but I think first and foremost is that diet providing a certain level of nutrition that allows us to stay in good health, while also avoiding excess of certain nutrients and or energy that would also lead to poor physical health. And so that's our kind of first rung. And then the second things are these indirect aspects beyond that. But of course, all of that is interconnected. And so I list them as almost these three separate areas. Well, really, you can't decipher between them, because everything is in this biopsychosocial context, and we can't really just have one without the other. But there are some things that I would flag, or at least for me, when I think about the health impact. And underneath all of that is that it's really an accumulation of these habits over a long period of time. And so it's, how does one sustain certain types of dietary practices that over the long term are going to lead to those health outcomes that we want? So reduction of risk of chronic disease, or at least not increasing that by certain ways of eating.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. I guess it's more than just like the food sources, because like, well, yes, obviously the food sources are playing into energy components, the micronutrient components, but as you said, like there's also the cultural aspect to like foods, the social aspect of foods. And I think sometimes when you're when you're maybe talking to people who are just kind of getting into looking after a diet, they are almost trying to think of, how can I just is there a kind of meal plan that I can follow that's just going to be like the healthy diet, like the few things that I need to kind of look at? When obviously like the healthy diet, I guess you'd say, is it's a pattern of behaviors related to food, and like some of them almost aren't even related to just the foods you take in, like even like how you're eating food. One of the examples I always like one of the examples like I talk about with clients is related to, you know, when you're in a country like Spain or Italy or like an area that follows like the Mediterranean diet, and the Mediterranean diet has obviously been, you know, spouted as like one of the most healthful diets. But you know, as an Irish person, you look at all the foods that like they're having, right? They're really high in fats, like, you know, cured meats and all this kind of stuff. But how a lot of people in these countries eat is there's a big social factor to the way they kind of like eat and prepare foods. Like they all kind of like if you have a siesta in Spain, like they're all eating like food together. And I guess like there's, even though you might have these foods that are very like they're hyper palatable to a degree, right? They're like high in fat, high in
Mm.
salt, um, and they are high in calories. But because there's the social element tied to it, there's more than just the gorging on food that's happening at like the meal. Like there's the social element that's playing into it. So, you know, I guess that's where for me I can definitely see the social side of it. But then as well, also just, you know, the healthy diet doesn't necessarily need to be followed every single day. Like if you are having
Mm.
a enjoyable weekend with a family or something like that, it doesn't need to be everything's perfect. No, like you can have pizza, you can have ice cream, but are other kind of boxes of like health being essentially ticked off throughout the week. I think that's kind of like where the important factor of it is.
Right. Because I mean, we could list down on paper a certain diet and make an evaluation of, does this diet provide someone with sufficient micronutrition, for example?
Mm.
And we could pretty easily classify that just by looking at the foods and doing an analysis of what nutrients contains. But without any further context, I couldn't really say for a certain person following this, are they going to be healthy because of it? Because the other things that relates to health here is someone's behaviors related to the food, but also their cognitions, so their thoughts about that. And so I'm sure you as well as I know many people who have been in a situation where their diet is in terms of healthful foods. So they're typically minimally processed foods. They're getting enough protein. They're getting enough micronutrients. They're not over consuming calories. And you look at it, and they're trying to do everything perfect, but they're just messed up in terms of how they think about food, their preoccupation with food, the negative connotations they have with trying to strive to eat this certain way, fear they have around eating other types of foods, avoidance of certain social situations, and massive restriction of either certain types of foods or even outright calorie restriction
Mm.
on a consistent basis. And all those things lead to them being absolutely miserable, but also in many cases having certain physical symptoms as well. And so to say that person is healthy because they are not over consuming saturated fat or calories
Yeah.
or salt, and they're getting enough micronutrients because they're eating plenty of salad, we can't really say that. So there's these other components that relate to not only what we eat or not, but how we think about those things and how we frame them in our mind. I think that's maybe underappreciated sometimes too.
Mm. Yeah, it goes back to that like more than one type of health. Like, you know, there's a physical health, you know, the healthfulness, I guess, of your diet, emotional health, social health, like, you know, strength relationships, and I guess as you mentioned there, like somebody could have these kind of tendencies. Are, I guess you kind of call that like more orthorexia. Would that be correct? Like a kind of obsession with like clean eating.
Certainly can tie into certain cases. It could be a whole spectrum of different things in terms of those cognitions, even if it's not an outright case of orthorexia. It could
Mm.
be some pattern of disordered eating, which doesn't necessarily mean that the types of foods someone has is problematic. It could just be down to, like I said, those cognitions behind
Yeah.
those, the reasons for doing it. And so you could have two people who maybe on paper look like they're consuming a similar type of diet, but could view that completely differently and could have either negative or positive psychological impacts on that person, and therefore their outcomes are going to be different. And so it's, again, a lot of it is related to that the psychology behind why they're choosing to do something, and some of those motivational drivers underneath.
The psychology behind, I guess, adherence is it's a fascinating one. It's one that we're going to get into in a little bit. But I guess kind of following on from, you know, I guess firstly, I guess the kind of definitions here, I guess, around like, healthfulness, I guess, and then like, healthy behaviors within a diet context. Within, I guess, like, each government is going to give some kind of recommendations as to, like, how we should go about, like, improving the healthfulness of our diet. So what do the food guidelines like actually say? Because I guess like you'll always hear people say the food pyramid. That's the reason we're all, fat and sick, and that's the reason our country is fucked up. But like, what did the food guidelines actually say, and are we actually even following them?
So there's a couple of components to this. First of all, when people mention the food pyramid, it's kind of laughable because this was a visual representation as part of the US dietary guidelines that has been out of commission since 2011, I think was the last year that was retired at that particular concept. So since then, no one as a nutritional professional or talking about the guidelines would be referring to the food pyramid. But yet we have still people saying this is what is being pushed. In terms of the dietary guidelines, these, like you said, can vary from country to country. They have different ways of putting them across, but there are a number of things that are pretty much common across all of them. The other thing is when people can go, like the dietary guidelines are free to read online, but in a lot of cases, they're not necessarily set up just for a consumer to go and read, okay, here's how I'm going to build a healthy diet. A lot of it is done for people who are providing that information. So the first part is a kind of review of the evidence, what we can say about these things, and then what that means for recommendations that should or shouldn't be given. One of the big shifts that's happened over the last couple of decades has been more and more focus on the dietary pattern, which is the typical, on average, type of diet someone is going to be following, as opposed to at any one time point. So it's this typical pattern that you may have. The second part of it is more of a focus on food-based recommendations, as opposed to discussing quantities of certain nutrients, because oftentimes that's not really useful. It's not very pragmatic. It's not very comprehensible. And so more of it is on what is a food-based recommendation or what is a dietary pattern-based recommendation more so. And so typically most of the guidelines are going to converge on recommending a dietary pattern that tends to have a basis of lots of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, as opposed to refined grains, other food groups like nuts and seeds. They would have a list of protein-based foods, and again with a preference more for either plant-based proteins, fish, or lean cuts of meat, as opposed to fatty cuts of meat. And then a reduction of foods that provide the nutrients that, when taken in excess, are most likely to increase risk of chronic disease. So that would be keeping a control over the quantity of total saturated fat in the diet, the total amount of sodium, and then the amount of added sugars would be the kind of three primary ones. Within that, then the foods that tend to provide most of that to the diet tend to be ones that are, and again, this is an area where there is a bit of a gray area, but in general, the highly processed packaged goods that are going to be high in a combination of those things. So at the same time being high in sugar, sodium, and fat. So pastries or chocolates, all that type of stuff people typically think of when they have that term junk food in their mind. And then other things like general recommendations to limit the overall quantity of red meat. This might in part be down to that it tends to come with saturated fat, so particularly if it's a fatty cut of meat, but otherwise then that when consumed at a high level, there's evidence to suggest it could increase risk of chronic disease. So having a limit on that, and you'll see variations of what that limit may be. But in general, then you end up with this dietary pattern where the bulk of it is built on fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and then lean source of protein. And then within the foods that provide fat, you're probably trying to limit the amount of saturated fat as a food-based recommendation that ends up being a general heuristic of sources of fat that are from plants as opposed to animals tends to lead to this fat profile where there's less coming from saturated fat and more coming from unsaturated fats, so particularly polyunsaturated fat. And so that's generally what some of those guidelines say. In terms of what that looks like on paper, then there's examples that different ones will look like. Different guidelines have different visual representations. So it could be a plate, which you might see in a variety of countries are now using that, like a visual representation of how much of the plate comes from these different types of food groups. But that's generally kind of what they're doing. And it is set up to say, if we're giving advice to people, if we push more of people in the population towards this general type of dietary pattern, it's going to lead to healthy outcomes. What it isn't is a specific prescription for every individual of this is the perfect diet for you per se. And so that type of criticism doesn't make any sense. That if someone can say, well, it's recommending this type of food, but I can't do that. For example, most of them are going to be on a high fiber diet. We could find individuals that maybe are suffering with IBS, and for a certain short period of time working with a dietitian, they might purposely go through a low fiber diet and see a reduction in their symptoms, and it provides a benefit. This is something that is clearly known in dietetics, but that is an individual case with this person. And so saying that, well, this shows that if that person followed the dietary guidelines, it's all nonsense because they would be eating a high fiber diet. It just misses the point completely. The dietary guidelines is if we shift more of the population to this type of dietary pattern, you're going to see improvements in health and massive reductions in chronic disease risk. And they generally converge on those types of foundational pieces that I just mentioned.
I think it's important there that you mentioned that it's not meant to be like a prescription. I guess like just as you were like made that point, I was thinking like, yeah, we have exercise guidelines, but like they're guidelines, they're not like a prescription. Like there's no like, if you want to be healthy and do resistance training, you have to do like 3 sets of squats, 3 sets of leg press,
Right.
all this kind of stuff, right? Like that part, I guess, is up to the user, the person in the population to like do their own kind of investigation on. I guess there's only so much, I guess, that we can be kind of. There's only so much that we can essentially be not spoon fed, but like, you know, kind of guided towards before we have to take some control and have some autonomy in the situation. So yeah, I thought that was an interesting way to kind of look at it. I guess with the guidelines, like a common criticism, right, of guidelines is that they are like pushed by industry. You'll hear this from certain kind of sides of like the diet world where they're saying that they're trying to like, you know, squash the beef industry, or they're trying to, you know, the cereal companies are trying to like edge their way in there and kind of give the politicians all the money. But I guess like how do we come about like the guidelines? Like what type of like rigor is kind of put in place to kind of ensure that like what we're kind of recommending at like a population level is like in the best interest of health?
So I think there's obviously grains of truth that people can find in different places. And I think this is certainly the case, most notably with the US dietary guidelines, just given the prevalence of lobbying as a general phenomenon in the US. And you have a lobby for all these different types of groups. And so whether that is for cereal industry or whether that's for the beef or dairy industry themselves, there's all going to be some lobbying going on there. However, when it comes to the actual guidelines, these are put together on the basis of the overall evidence as reviewed by a whole range of different experts. And so even before the guidelines are starting to be updated, so every 5 years they get updated, before that process goes ahead in the US, there will be basically an advisory board of independent scientists from around the US that are brought together, experts in their field, and they will generate a scientific report on their evaluation of the evidence. So this is not making new guidelines. This is going through certain specific research questions related to the guidelines, things that might need to be updated or not. Do we have new evidence in certain areas? Are some of the things that are in the current guidelines still accurate based on the latest evidence that we have? And then this advisory committee will go and spend a couple of years looking into these questions, putting out this scientific report, and off the base of that, make some potential recommendations to the USDA when they're going to update those guidelines. And then that's a whole separate process as well. And so within this, there's a whole range of scientific rigor. There's the same process you would see from best practices within research, as in they go through, list very specific research questions they want to look at. There's then a number of people that are on that committee in charge and going and evaluating that evidence. Then they have to be able to grade the quality of the evidence for each of these questions, and then be able to say whether we have sufficient evidence or not to make a change to a particular recommendation, or to make a recommendation of this might be useful. And so that's a stringent process over a couple of years. All of that is completely transparent in the sense that everything has to be done within the confines of their meetings that are on record and all that communication. And afterwards, anything that comes out of that report is then open to a democratic process of basically anyone in the population can come and put forward their feedback. And there's in-person meetings for that purpose as well. And so there's all this process of being able to try and evaluate the evidence of what we do and don't know. And so off the back of that, anytime guidelines are generated, it's not like there's just a room of a couple of people coming together and saying, well, what diet do we like? Let's put that into some guidelines. This is a huge number of people, a huge amount of checks and balances that are put in place to do that. Saying that, it doesn't mean that every time guidelines are out there, there's nothing that someone reasonable couldn't have a maybe difference of opinion on, right? And so one of the classic ones over the last few years within nutrition science circles has been, within different countries, we see slightly different emphasis placed on certain dairy products or not. And this is because this is a gray area of some of the research. And so there's not one correct answer. And so you see slight preferences for more or less, or a stronger view on the necessity or not to include that as part of these certain food groups. And so that's a good point of debate. And so it doesn't mean that every guideline is perfect, but to say that it's not based on anything or is just pulled out of nowhere because someone is paying the scientists to say this is a complete misunderstanding of what's going on. And so in general, the problem of the amount of ill health we have in the general population, in most Western countries at least, is not a result of the guidelines driving that. It's mainly that most people don't follow something that's close to the guidelines. And this is pretty clear in most of the research that's been done in this area. When you look at the typical dietary pattern and how that differs to what is recommended in the dietary guidelines, there's a huge discrepancy. And so it's that most people are just not consuming anything close to what the guidelines recommend. And if they did, based on all the predictive models that we have, you would see massive improvements in population health. And so this is the kind of crux of the matter of to say that people are getting, or there's more ill health now. That's also in combination with people not actually following something that looks like the dietary guidelines. And that's pretty clear. You can look at any of those food groups that get recommended: fruits and vegetables, whole grains, total amount of dietary fiber. Like 90% of the population plus tends to underconsume the amount of dietary fiber that would be recommended in these. So it's that people aren't following them. It's not that these guidelines themselves are driving some sort of ill health.
Yeah. And like as a practitioner myself, like, you know, I coach a lot of people for nutrition, and it's very, very rare that, like, when I'm looking at somebody's, like, you know, nutrition logs, when they first start up, that they are like coming anywhere close to like guidelines. Like, again, as you mentioned there, the things that are commonly missing is fiber tends to be quite low. Like, you know, very commonly will I see below 15 or even 10 grams per day. You know, maybe completely no fruits and vegetables throughout the week. You know, I think a lot of people now are like a lot better at, like, you know, including more like lean meats within their diet. But I also do think that in the pursuit of trying to get more protein into the diet too, people also do kind of fall into the habit of consuming a lot more ultra processed foods that also do just carry with them. Like, some of them contain a lot more kind of saturated fat, and the likes, just for, like, you know, the chocolate coatings and stuff like this, right? So I can definitely see how people are kind of like missing out in that regard. I guess like there's a kind of number of different reasons why like people are maybe not necessarily going to be following or getting close to kind of include more fiber, include more fruits and vegetables. Like I guess Ireland is probably a little bit different to the States in the sense that like Ireland is a lot more compact, whereas like in the States you have these like areas where you could be, you know, miles and miles and miles and miles away from a gas station, never mind a supermarket that would have like fresh fruits and vegetables. So you're probably reliant on more cheap processed foods just to get energy in, just to survive is probably a lot higher. Whereas in Ireland we have a lot more. I don't know. After living in a few different countries, like I lived in Canada, I lived in the States for a while, and like, you know, over here now in Spain. Don't know how good we have it regards to food quality in Ireland, and
Right.
like even like
Yeah.
and even food prices. So it is definitely like a little bit easier in Ireland. But like, what would you say are kind of like some things that are affecting people's ability to even, you know, follow close to these guidelines? Like, is it education or is it implementation? What do you think is the barrier?
It really depends on the circumstance, and I think there's, depending on what aspect we're looking at a general population level, probably one of the things that unfortunately doesn't get discussed enough in my opinion is just socioeconomics. And so there's literal situations of it is very difficult to even pay attention to some of these dietary changes when you have a significant number of people, even in Ireland, in the UK, in countries that people maybe don't realize, there's a significant percentage of the population living in food poverty. And so making decisions that of, it's not about, okay, I'm going to choose what to buy this week based on these health recommendations. It's like, what can I actually afford that's going to allow
Yeah.
me to get by? What do I need to cut back on in terms of my groceries this week so I can pay my bills? What foods can I select because I'm not able to afford to use the oven this week? Like, these are real things that are happening, and those are impacting food choices without doubt. And in many situations, you could have something that on paper maybe isn't the best dietary choice nutritionally, but actually is the smartest choice based on that person's situation at that moment in terms of finance and so on. Then there's the whole aspect around the extra stressors that comes into someone's life when they're in these situations driven by food poverty and generally socioeconomics. So all those things can impact our ability to interact with these healthy guidelines. And anytime we're talking about the health status of a population, I mean, it's so closely tied to wealth status in general, that to try and brush it aside and say, well, everyone just needs to make the best of what they can do. It's like, yeah, but it's there's a lot more to it than that. So there's that aspect to it. The second aspect is, if we move to, let's say, people who are lucky enough not to be in those situations, but are just the maybe typical client that comes to you and says, look, I know what you're telling me, but I'm just finding it really difficult to put these things in place, or I find that I do it for a week and then can't stay doing those things, right? I find that just typically the diet I default to ends up being this kind of low fiber, convenient diet. The main reasons for that is it's just more convenient and easier to select certain types of foods. And so this can be a useful thing for certain aspects of our life. If we're particularly busy and someone has a lot of work on, maybe other stresses, and has less literal time, but also less cognitive load to be thinking about their diet overall. Thankfully now there's ways that we can still get nutrition in just through some very convenient and quick means, but that tends to probably lead us slightly closer to this dietary pattern where there is going to be more, let's say, highly processed foods in the diet, which probably is going to put up typical sodium intake that if we didn't have those foods, or is going to mean we have less control over the actual ingredients in the certain meals we're having. There's ways around that, but in general, without certain types of planning, it's going to probably lead us more into that route. So I think one is on the convenience one, which gets is tied to these things around time and stress and so on. Then there's just the habit building or a customization to certain ways of eating that with anything in life, if we try to make a significant change to something that we've been doing for a significant period of time, there's always going to be this kind of inertia to slip back to what we were doing before. And it takes a period of time of doing something different consistently before that starts to replace that old norm and become a new norm. Mm. And so then, particularly in times where we're not thinking as much, or we're more stressed, we have stuff going on, or there's a change to our schedule, then of course there's that other risk of then slipping back into a more default pattern, which happens with most things. So I think there are a few of the things, but in general, it's probably just an ease and convenience thing for all of us, that it's that we can get access to all these different types of foods conveniently, often quite cheaply, food that tastes good, and just becomes more and more of a norm as opposed to what we previously have done. And so it does just take more planning and more awareness of those things to try and fit within some of these recommendations, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I think if you're the subset of the population who has like more of the kind of means and opportunity to improve your diet, like and not like the subset of the population who like it's very much a time and finances side of the coin, like you're obviously in a much better position to make these changes. But as you said, like convenience is still a big thing, and like with a lot of people that I'd work with that's what it comes down to 90% of the time. It's not that they don't want to eat healthier, it's just right. It's just not as convenient. But like I think sometimes people feel almost like a little bit guilty for going with a convenient choice, even if it is like a healthier alternative, like in a certain context, like, and even something as literally trivial as like frozen vegetables or frozen fruit over fresh fruit and fresh vegetables. Like one barrier I've run into multiple times with people having more fruits and vegetables within their diet is like they buy it, they forget about it, and then it's in the fridge and it's rotten after a few days, and it's just a waste of money. And
right,
simply just making a change to having like frozen, like, and don't get me wrong, like frozen vegetables like are not as nice as fresh ones, right? But I guess if you trade one thing, you're trading another one for it. Like, you know, if you want more convenience, there might not be as good taste, or like even in context of the ready meals these days, which are everywhere, right? While they are very, very convenient, and like, you know, they might help you, like, you know, stick to a calorie goal or kind of give you a certain level of protein and for a certain amount of calories, there might be a higher sodium, there may be a higher sodium load, there may be less kind of vegetables than you would get in the kind of same meal that you might prepare for yourself. But again, it's just like, it's one of these trade-offs, but it's still more of a positive choice than maybe saying, I'll just go to the Chinese and get a 3-in-1. Like, you know, I guess it's trying to look at these, like, trying to look at your behaviors on a spectrum versus it being like a kind of good and bad choice. You know, the one person going into Spar with €5 could get, like, you know, a whole grain roll made with like salad and some like lean meats at the deli counter and get like an apple or like a bag of popcorn, and some person can go in and get like a breakfast roll, right? There's gonna be they're the same €5, but they're completely different like thing that you're walking out and completely different like affecting your health. And naturally, if you get the breakfast roll one day, it's not going to be an issue, right? But if it's like if it's an everyday thing, that might be a bit more of an issue, right? So I think it's again, it's trying to frame things like this to people in the context of trying to improve their diet, and try to help educate people that there's still some kind of level of control that they can have, like if they have the means and opportunities to do so. Again, it might not be like the most appealing option, but I guess if the motivation is there to kind of become healthier or improve the healthfulness, I guess it is something that you have to expose yourself to. And similar to the idea of, you know, when you eat more of a hyperpalatable diet, those are the foods that you like are more attracted to. But if you start to eat more whole foods, or more fruits, more vegetables, they start to taste nicer over time. You know, it's trying to kind of train your kind of brain, train your food palate to kind of engage in these behaviors more.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly what you say of when I talk about what we're accustomed to eating, having changes that are very similar to what we typically eat, but just better alternatives. Some of the examples that you give is a far better way to go. And I think part of the problem when people trying to maybe adopt let's say, healthier habits. Maybe they look at an example of the dietary guidelines or look up a Mediterranean diet, and it tends to be this thing that's so different from what we typically do. And this is this idealized diet that is very difficult to start doing, right? The preparation, having to buy all these different ingredients, new types of meals that we're not used to defaulting to. And so it becomes, it's like, oh, I'm not going to be able to do this, or after a few days we can't do it, so just giving up. And that is the norm because it's very difficult to do it. And it's one of the main criticisms I have of most of the content I tend to see in like this whole wellness space, right? That it evangelizes certain types of foods and these are the best foods to have. And it's always things of like trying to get people to consume things that they don't normally do, but it's so different from what we're normally going to be consuming that it's not useful because no one's going to stay doing it, right? And it's also unnecessary. So like you said, if someone wants to improve their health and typically they have, let's say, the average diet, if they're starting to make changes by, okay, I'm going to stay having a sandwich at lunch, I'm going to have whole grain bread instead of normal bread with this, I'm going to add some extra salad to that sandwich that I don't normally do, or instead of having a bowl of cornflakes in the morning, instead I'm going to have some yogurt with a few berries and that cornflakes mixed within it if you want. There's all these small changes that can be made. Or at dinner, okay, I'm going to change the proportions of what I'm including. So I have extra veg on the plate, or maybe I have an extra handful of lentils or something like that. What small changes can be made to someone's current diet is probably much more likely to be beneficial. And so it's over time, tweaking these things a bit at a time is going to lead to much more long-term change than saying, oh, here's an example of the ultimate Mediterranean diet and you're going to have kefir and all these fermented foods at this time and you're going to have to buy this whole list of ingredients that no one ever buys. And it's again, oftentimes it's I don't know, for me it's away from something that's practical and is more part of just the kind of wellness online influencer cult that I have no interest in.
Yeah, it like if you're to look at it like a kind of healthful diet between like a group of people, like there's going to be meals in there that maybe look similar, but there's also going to be meals in there that look completely different, because tied into it is like it's the preference and like, you know, what you enjoy aspect of it. And I guess, you know, with the kind of guidelines that we talked about earlier, like they're like, it's broad, like, you know, like lean meats is a broad category, fruits and vegetables is a broad category, like whole grains, broad category. Like, you know, there's lots of different different food like sources that can make up all of that. Like, you know, for myself, in my early 20s, I didn't have like a great diet, and I was very, very, very resistant to including like any kind of fruits and vegetables. And like, even when I think about like how I started having fruit, like I was working as a personal trainer, had to be up early in the morning, need to get some energy in, so I just like have like a protein shake, and I was like, I'll try a banana in this, and like just blend it up, and then next morning I was like, I'll try some frozen raspberries, then frozen blueberries, and then all of a sudden I'm having like a 5 or 6 fruit smoothie. I'm like, I love this, can't believe I didn't have this before. And then like all of a sudden, like I'm including them in different meals and stuff like that, and it was just like a kind of stepwise process of it. And I think that's what it has to be for a lot of people. Like there's a trend now of like people going onto ChatGPT and like asking them to like make up meal plans for them. And I've seen some examples of them. Good. And like the examples of them could be like so far removed from what somebody, like as you said, would eat there. Even like the cooking process of them is just so fucking pedantic, you know. Right. Whereas like, you know, so some of my clients in a time rush, right? They might be like, I need to, you know, I need to do some meal prep, but I'm not just going through all this like rigmarole of like, you know, having this fancy recipe. I'm like, get like, you know, your rice in a rice cooker, get your frozen veg, cook on a pan, cook some chicken in the air fryer, and love it in together. Like, you know, like some meals I guess don't have to be 5-star Michelin, you know, star meals to
almost nothing. Like that's the thing. It can be so simple, and that's the point of, rather than looking at these specific diets, looking at, okay, what are the fundamental things that are most important that are going to improve your health? Then looking at what do you currently do on average, and then just picking what are the things that the most obvious change that you can make. So even if someone wanted to use ChatGPT, that's what I would do. I would like put in an example of your current diet, the way you normally eat, and be honest with it. And then to say, what is like the 2 or 3 pieces of lowest hanging fruit that I could change here? And that's the way I used to do it a lot of times with when I was coaching people. I remember an example of, there was a guy I had, and he had busy kind of schedule, and he had certain things of like, he wasn't trying to be an elite athlete, but he was doing like CrossFit like 3 times a week. And he says, but one thing I want to keep is that usually of like a Friday, I always get a takeaway with my girlfriend and we watch TV. It's like, is there any way like could do that? So then you're working within these certain constraints, which is much better because it's real life. That's going to be normal. And then you can say, okay, here for the first couple of weeks, we're going to look at what you normally do. And then from there, we're going to basically keep his meal times the same, the types of meals the exact same, but just make changes and swaps where needed. Some of the examples I gave earlier of putting in whole grain bread, and that's going to be now the norm, or having in some of those snacks or a breakfast that there is a portion of berries that wasn't there before. And those things are the things that add up over time. And then, okay, when you're going to have something on a Friday, can we do this, right? That you're going to pick what your favorite dish is, but you're also maybe not going to have a dessert and a starter with it, or maybe you're going to have like one beer instead of 3, and like things that are basically the structure of what he's doing is the exact same, but you're just making these small stepwise changes that over time are going to give overall healthier intake, because you're adding in these different things, or you're swapping certain ingredients for others, but basically the preparation for those meals is the same. The person knows how to do them, and then you're just changing and tweaking things over time to make it more likely they do it. And I think this is that's the way to do it. And I mean, there's even I'm sure you've seen there's this for people who have more aesthetic goals as well. I think Eric Helms speaks really well about his kind of a default diet concept, where basically the skeleton or the structure between different phases of the year is the exact same types of meals that someone is having, but just at different times they're going to have more or less ingredients that are going to give more or less overall energy content. But the typical structure and the types of meals someone's consuming is relatively consistent. So there's not this major change when someone's aesthetic goal changes or their performance goal changes. And it should be the same with our health, that the structure of what we tend to like to consume is pretty much the same, but we can just change some of those ingredients in the most simple way. And that is going to accumulate to have a bigger change than, okay, I need to revamp my diet. Let me look up this new one on ChatGPT and I'm going to try and follow this perfectly. But yeah, it's not going to work.
Yeah. It's like, oh, I'm dieting now, so I need to change and overhaul everything I'm doing with nutrition, or I'm trying to gain weight or whatever it is. I need to follow my bulking diet, where it's just like, yeah, I guess I'd describe to like Eric's default kind of diet. Like it'd just be like more food, less food, more food, less food, and like some of the food sources are going to change around. But like I guess at the heart of it, you're trying to still adhere to the protein content, the fiber content, still having like meal times, meal frequency, like all to be kind of relatively similar, but not getting like overly anxious about a lot of those kind of like lesser like variables of importance, right? Like I think I guess we haven't talked about this as part of like the kind of dietary part, but like I guess sometimes people in maybe more kind of like the general population probably overemphasize like the need of like meal timing, meal frequency, whereas like for most people it's just a case of like having a meal frequency and meal time that kind of suits their schedule more than anything else, considering that a fairly broad range of frequencies tend to like promote like the health of the diet. Like I guess it's for most people the frequency is going to be a driver of like of calories throughout the day, right? And then also it's going to fit within the structure of their work day, and most people struggle with that then when it comes to weekends because they don't have the structure of work, right? But I guess maybe I could ask you a tiny bit about that. I know I didn't mention I was going to kind of bring this up, but like how much does the average person even need to like worry about the likes of timing and frequency of their meals, like as well as all this other stuff that we just talked about?
So I think you're right. When you look at the list of priorities, it wouldn't be at the top. So when we think of the things that are most likely to be important is, okay, what is your overall dietary pattern? And in terms of how much energy does that provide? So i.e. for health purposes, we don't want someone over consuming calories over a long-term basis. And then in general, that the food choices are pretty decent, while still having that flexibility to include food someone likes. But in general, we have a healthy dietary pattern. Those things are going to give someone the vast majority of their results that they need. And if someone is not doing those things right now, adding in an extra layer of complexity of having to have a specific timing that's not that suitable is just making it more difficult than it needs to be. Where there's maybe some individual tweaking that can be done is that, for example, with timing, it probably doesn't matter much from a literal metabolic effect, in that if you have two diets that are equivalent in terms of the foods, the calories, the macronutrients, and so on, slight changes in timing of those meals and distribution of where you consume those calories across the day likely isn't going to make much of a difference. However, there is some evidence suggesting that on average, if some people consume a greater percentage of that energy in the earlier part of the day as opposed to late in the day, that can lead to a better management of hunger. So what that means maybe in the real world, for someone who maybe is struggling with consuming an appropriate number of calories overall and is maybe wants to maybe limit the hunger that they're feeling at a certain time, there may be a benefit for them trying, okay, for my final meal of the day, I'm going to start having a meal that's relatively smaller than I normally do, but having more of those calories early in the day, and maybe for that person that allows them to have less hunger. That's potentially where there's some of this experimentation on an individual level come in. But in general, it's not going to be that important. For some, there are some metabolic effects of eating very late at night. So we see, this is typically where we talk about the biological night, which is when our melatonin levels surpass a certain threshold. And at this point that we refer to as biological night will differ from person to person. So it's not just the clock time. It depends on someone's chronotype, which is again based on this melatonin rhythm that someone has and at what time that's going to increase. That once melatonin goes up by a certain amount and we're into that biological night period, having a large amount of, let's say, carbohydrate or dietary fat tends to lead to a worse postprandial response, meaning the response after we consume that meal. So if you look at the blood glucose after that meal or the amount of free fatty acids that are in the bloodstream after that meal, they can be different if someone consumes that meal at night versus during the day. And so there is some potential benefit there from avoiding those huge meals, particularly if it's at that nighttime period, and having those earlier in the day. But in general, the things that are the bottleneck for most people's progress to eating an overall healthy diet is probably not slight changes in the times of their meals. Timing can make it more convenient and easier for someone to do. But again, this is where there tends to be some variation. And we see this in practice most of the time because there's no one piece of evidence that's going to show this. But anyone who's coached people will know some people just find it way easier to stick to their overall planned dietary intake if they don't eat first thing in the morning. Maybe just have a cup of coffee and then have their breakfast at like 10:30. For other people, they need to eat first thing, and that helps them just manage the rest of the day way easier. And so there is no one timing from I would say, an adherence perspective that is best per se. But we then do have these other pieces of evidence around hunger levels across the day or postprandial response if you eat at biological night. This is where some of that chrononutrition work comes in and may have more implications for people having large meals at nighttime, let's say. But in general, I think I would agree with you that there are other things that are more important to do. And if someone can follow an overall healthy dietary pattern by something that suits their lifestyle, then I wouldn't really worry about, you ate here at 9 p.m. instead of 8 p.m. or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely would. I'd agree with all those points. It's one thing that I've like tried to probably not even consciously try to shift more towards over time is like having more of my meals earlier on in the day, because for the longest time I used to kind of follow the approach of trying to fast until like midday 12 or so, and for me personally, that made my hunger experience or diet experience like actually worse, because I actually found that by the time we got to that point, my hunger was so high that throughout the rest of the day, then no meals really kind of satiated me as much, and I actually found I actually had more of a drive towards having more convenient or high protein foods. But that's my experience. I know, but for some of my clients, like that, like approach for them works perfectly. But I think that speaks to the individual, like individuality of like the timing aspect, right? Because like again, for some people it's gonna be worth thing where it kind of suits them better. So for some people it could be like an adherence thing, right? So it's like whatever type of timing or frequency allows you to both feel your best but also adhere to like your kind of like diet structure like with ease, like that's the one to go towards. Because I guess the one thing that had been kind of circling around years and years ago, like going back to when I kind of first got into the industry, was still the concept of, oh, you should eat like many times throughout the day to stoke the metabolic furnace, right? And I like, even when I did my personal training course, I remember we were getting like had a lecture on nutrition, and like the lecturer kind of mentioned that, and I'd been like reading line McDonald's website, so I put my hand up and I was like, that's not true. And we got into a bit of an argument, but that I think that kind of notion is going to come around a little bit more now in regards to people saying, oh no, eating like 6 meals across the day seems to be like the best thing for your metabolism, whatever like that. But I think now they're kind of spinning it towards, it seems to be best for your digestion, because you're not having these kind of large meals, whatever. And like maybe there's some validity to that. I know there is some people who do prefer having smaller meals, but I guess I don't know if that is just down to people's own tolerance of bloating. Like personally, I don't mind having a big meal and feeling like a little bit bloated, but some people maybe a little bit more versed to it. But anyway, I think I'm going on a little bit of a tangent there.
Yeah,
so
no, not at all. I think it's important because I think it shows that a lot of time, in lieu of actually having a clear answer from evidence, a lot of people try and fit these pieces together that make sense of like, oh, well, this is better for your digestion, because you hear people can say the opposite, right? You'll say, oh, if you want good digestion, actually you only want to eat maybe 2 or 3 times a day at most, so you have more digestive rest in between, as opposed to constantly being in this. So people fit together these different narratives, and it's like, okay, well, is there evidence that if you do this versus this, we actually see difference in outcomes? And so then in a practical setting, if someone notices that they feel better or worse with one or the other, okay, go with that. But apart from that, let's not be making claims that everyone is better off by doing this, that, or the other.
Yeah, for sure. Again, it's there's many of us on the planet. There's no way that all of us could be doing the exact same thing and kind of getting towards the same destination. Even like if you think about culturally, like how somebody in Ireland eats is completely different to how somebody in India eats, or like even I know some people, there's some issues with like the concepts of blue zones, or maybe there's maybe you understand a little bit about that, but I've heard there's some controversy on like the kind of studies of blue zone. But I guess there's so many of them across the world, and naturally dietary patterns are different. I know there's like some kind of behaviors that are like pretty similar across like different populations there, but like just the dietary factor alone, like there's different kind of tendencies there. So like but there's populations of people who are like living the longest on the planet, and some have a decent quality of life too. So I guess again it speaks to why we need to kind of understand what the overall kind of trends, guidelines are, and kind of try to move towards those, and maybe not get as kind of bogged down in some of these kind of minutiae as maybe you kind of hear in social media.
Yeah. Oftentimes it's just concerns of the worried well, of people who are doing basically everything that they need to do. Everything is going along fine, and this striving to optimize, for lack of a better term, that gets pushed in certain places on the internet, it is kind of part of that, is of people who are the ones that are in the small percentage of people who have an overall healthy dietary pattern, that are doing things right, that are healthy, and have this obsession of thinking that needs to be something done more, or there's this other secret out there, or this other tweak is going to have this massive change. And maybe there's things that could have some impact, but yeah, it's oftentimes it's worrying about small little details that really are inconsequential, I think.
Sticking with that, right, with the worried well, right? So there's definitely a lot of concepts that have come that's been more prevalent on the social media nutrition side of things more than ever. Particularly the likes of seed oils and the likes of saturated fat carnivore diet being pushed. There's also, I don't think the sugar and insulin one has ever went away. I think like that's like kind of went like that since I got into the industry, and I know you before got into the industry it was like that too. But I want to talk a little bit about these kind of things because I guess there are things that I see on social media all the time, and they just kind of infuriate me. I guess people overemphasizing the importance of taking these specific things out of their diet, and then kind of missing the forest for the trees, where they're not looking like as we talked for the first hour of this podcast around the overall dietary pattern. So the first question I'd kind of ask for you, I'd ask here is like, with all of this like controversy around like seed oils that seems to be coming up, and people saying that they are like going to be like the worst thing in the world for you, like putting machine lubricant into your body. I guess where does this like concept that these are like negative for health stem from?
So there's, at least in my opinion, there's these kind of two areas that they come from. One is based around a naturalistic fallacy, as that these are products that have only relatively recently entered the food system for humans, because now we have this ability to refine these oils in the way that they're currently refined, and this process then is unnatural and leads to problems, right? And they have a whole host of things that comes from this, but it's built around this idea. Another part of that relates to kind of a historical context that is, again, going back to this more, in some cases, conspiratorial thinking. In some places, people aren't full out conspiratorial about it. But again, this connection with food industry and how the use of these certain seed oils then, and how that came about, and that they've entered into the food industry because they're cheap to make and all that type of stuff. There has to be something negative behind it. And then there's the other part, which is people who overly put faith in mechanistic studies and animal studies, and particularly looking at, say, polyunsaturated fats and saying, well, look, this is going to cause inflammation because we saw this in a mechanistic study, or this is what happens when you metabolize linoleic acid, blah, blah, blah. And so there's these different kind of buckets depending on where someone is. Right now, it's really popular because one of the best ways to generate interest and to build a following line is to find something that has that element of, hey, you were lied to about this. It's been a scam all along. Here's the real culprit. What you've been told about why we have these rates of chronic disease and obesity is actually down to this nutrient that the government is putting in our food supply. And so that does really well. And the seed oils things fits the bill for all of that. There are some more valid concerns that people could have, and we can discuss those. But so the two main things, or where it generally tends to come down to, the main claims, I think, is that seed oils cause inflammation. So they're going to cause chronic inflammation. And then as a result of that, it's going to increase the risk of heart disease, dementia, etc. But the main thing is that it's driving inflammation. Some of that is then built on mechanistic things that we do know that happens. So within these seed oils, so whether we're talking about rapeseed oil or sunflower oil, etc., soybean oil is one of the big ones in the US, that these oils have a significant proportion of polyunsaturated fats. And within that, one of those ones that people point to is linoleic acid. And the kind of chain of events is that linoleic acid can be converted then into arachidonic acid. And this then can go on to cause these production of these pro-inflammatory eicosanoids. And so we get this production of inflammation due to this increase in arachidonic acid, thanks to the high amount of linoleic acid in the diet. So you have this kind of claim that, okay, high amounts of linoleic acid in the diet is a problem, or high amounts of polyunsaturated fat in the diet is a problem. And then, or sometimes they tie that into the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3. So these, of course, linoleic acid is an omega-6 fatty acid. So this is the kind of claim. However, when you go beyond this mechanistic kind of chain of events and beyond some animal studies, and you look at any human studies across all the clinical trials that we have, look at meta-analyses and systematic reviews of these clinical trials, you can't see evidence in humans where you increase someone's polyunsaturated fat intake or linoleic acid intake, and that leads to a change in markers of inflammation. So whether you want to look at CRP, TNF-alpha, all these markers that typically get looked at for inflammation, you just don't see that it's driving inflammation, even on these kind of shorter term basis. When you extrapolate that out and look at other outcomes like actual heart disease, you don't see any differences there. Actually, you tend to see the opposite for polyunsaturated fats in general, that when that replaces saturated fat, you see massive reductions in risk of heart disease. But on the inflammation piece, you basically see nothing that they're driving. And this can be, there's been a study showing wild variance in linoleic acid. So you increase that by 100%. So you double that intake and you don't see an increase in inflammation. You reduce it by in half or more and you don't see any difference. So you see these big differences in linoleic acid and you're not seeing a change in inflammation. Some of the reason for that is then there's other evidence that shows us that changing linoleic acid, even by significant amounts, doesn't really translate to massive differences in arachidonic acid, which is, arachidonic acid, which is the thing that's driving inflammation in this hypothesis that they have. And so in the tissue, there's not this change in arachidonic acid. It's like 1% of that linoleic acid is probably going and being converted. And beyond that, you don't see this accumulation. Where some of this omega-6 to omega-3 story comes in is that if people have a really low intake of omega-3 fatty acids, that can lead to, let's say, a more pro-inflammatory state. And so adding omega-3 fatty acids into the diet, whether that's through fish or through supplementation, again, can maybe reduce some of those markers of inflammation if someone has a really, really low intake already. And also can be seen to replace some of that arachidonic acid that's in some of the cells and these immune cells that tend to be in tissues as well. So mechanistically, that would make sense. And so in those situations, if someone has a really low omega-3 intake, adding omega-3 into the diet maybe does tend to see an improvement in some of these inflammatory markers, but that's what's driving that change, not the change in the ratio per se. And so when it comes to omega-6 fatty acids, when it comes to linoleic acid, and then therefore seed oils, we're not seeing an increase in inflammation across any of these. The picture is really clear when it comes to heart disease risk, and polyunsaturated fats or omega-6 tends to see reductions in risk when you have higher amounts in the diet as opposed to an increase in risk. And then beyond that, the other side, like I said, is this naturalistic worry about the refining process. And it comes, like you said, of, oh, this was used in engine oil or as a lubricant, all this type of stuff, or it's really cheap to make, or well, it's refined oil and it's bleached and odorized and all the, like those things are true. That's a part of the process. But I think understanding that production is just because in this sense, the refining process, what that really means here for this oil is taking that initial part of the oil that was being pressed out in that initial mechanical pressing part of the process, and then just clearing out any of the impurities that are going to affect the quality and the taste and the smell of the oil. So there's still left within that initial part of the oil that's being squeezed out is different types of fatty acids, different types of impurities that we can remove through these kind of refining processes, from bleaching, deodorizing, which is removing kind of these more of that pungent, the compounds that are going to lead to a smell that we don't particularly like. And so at the end, you just get this oil that doesn't have this strong smell or taste, and that can be used, but doesn't necessarily mean there's anything negative with it. And oftentimes that can improve its shelf life. And often the other thing people worry about is when you cook with these oils, that's going to come rancid. Most of these oils, after going through that refining process, actually have a decently high smoke point, means that they can be cooked at a relatively high level. Where there is some valid concern, I would say, is that you can see maybe in cases where someone is using these oils with things like deep frying at
Yeah.
really high temperatures and doing that consistently, so reusing the same oil over and over again, that you may see an accumulation more of some of those negative compounds. But if someone is cooking at home and is using a seed oil, using it on the pan, using a normal amount, and cooking in a normal way, and you're not just reusing the same amount over and over again,
Mm.
there's virtually none of these worries that come up. And so, based on that, where is this human evidence that it's causing us harm? It just basically doesn't exist.
Mm. Yeah, like a lot of those things you mentioned there were very much like my understanding of like particularly there with the cooking of oils, because that's one thing I've always like you always hear from like fitness professionals too, like don't like don't use like again, it could be sunflower oil, it could be canola oil. Don't use these to cook. If you're going to use them, maybe use it to like add on to your food after, because of like the smoke point and the oil becoming rancid and stuff like that. But yeah, as you said there, it's like they're reusing. Like you go to McDonald's and they're using the same vat of oil all day. Like yeah, maybe that's going to be an issue, but like there's more. There might be a few more kind of issues than oil there. Like
Right, yeah.
if you're coming in, you're having like a triple Big Mac and fries and like a full fat Coke and all
Right.
this kind of stuff. Like maybe that's like more the thing that to be looking at, especially if that's like driving your diet to caloric excess overall. Like it's
Exactly. I
yeah.
mean, this is the almost the laughable thing of what's happening in the US right now, of like getting regulation around trying to reduce the amount of seed oils being used in like fast food chains. It's like, yeah, that's not going to change anyone's health, because if you're eating out of a fast food chain with a frequency that is high enough for the cooking oil to be a problem, then replacing that with just other type of oil or with lard or whatever it is, your diet is still not going to be good. Like
Yeah.
you're not changing the risk profile for anyone.
Mm.
But yeah, like you said, it's completely fine, and you don't see this production of all these problematic compounds that people claim when people are using it normally.
Yeah, I think just touching on what you mentioned there in regards to like what's proposed to be happening in the US. I've had a few conversations with like friends about it, because I'm like I'm the health and fitness guy in my friend groups. So I'm kind of asked like or like people are like, oh, isn't what RFK Jr. is doing, it's so great for like Americans' health. I'm like I like I think it's very much kind of overemphasizing the kind of wrong things, right? I think there's a cohort of people on like social media who are pushing kind of narratives towards singular ingredients, right? And it's always been like that. It's always been the flashy way to do it, because again, it has that like it tied to government conspiracy, like sugars being added to everything, and look all the kind of foods like on specific oils containing this amount of sugar, and like now it's, as you said, it's the seed oils. But like a lot of the changes that will be happening are essentially only going to affect the people who are probably struggling more with their health and with over fatness than the people who are in a position to like change their health, really,
Mm.
like because it is most often going to be people who are kind of going to these like fast food eateries, or going down the frozen food aisle, or going down the middle aisles of supermarkets, well, all the kind of the quote unquote junk food. They're the ones who are going towards these foods, and they go towards them because of maybe some financial reasons. They're a little bit cheaper, and then all of a sudden now we're taking out these ingredients that are maybe improving shelf life, maybe improving the price cost of these foods, and now those foods are taken away, and what the food manufacturers have to do, they have to source more expensive ingredients. That drives up food prices, and who gets the short end of the stick with that one? It's not the people who have a good good level of means to kind of have a healthy diet in the first place. It's the people who are already struggling to kind of make ends meet, and maybe struggling with their health. So I think it's like that. It's like as you said there, it's like the seed oils, the food dyes. One thing I've often kind of mentioned to people with the seed oils is like the reason they're using like likes of sunflower oil, vegetable oil in the likes of their fast food takeaways, or even in maybe more kind of stable shelf life products, is because if they were to use something like extra virgin olive oil, like the price of the product would like double or triple. Like the cost for something like vegetable oil or sunflower oil is marginally less than olive oil, it's definitely going to be cheaper than the likes of tallow or butter. And if you were to make some of these products with butter or tallow, they would not be like you simply wouldn't be able to make them because of just the difference of wouldn't be more kind of stable with room temperature, wouldn't be more kind of liquid based at room temperature, right? So I think there's so much that goes into it, but I guess those require like deeper levels of thought, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. I couldn't agree more. I mean, we don't want to get down the too much of a political route. I mean, but you don't even need to with this particular topic because, first of all, as we just noted, for me, seed oils aren't even a concern in the first place. But even if you were to accept all that, like I said, to think that you're going to meaningfully change the health of a nation by swapping out that McDonald's use seed oils and use tallow or some other oil instead is kind of laughable. Of like, how is that? If someone is consuming them with enough frequency, how is that change going to make any meaningful impact? Because the overall calorie content, sodium content, etc. of the diet is still going to be the same. Like you say, the knock-on effects economically for making these changes is always going to disproportionately affect people. And then to think that if you really wanted to improve the health of the population, particularly in a country where their health inequality and wealth inequality is so absurd, that if you really wanted to change it, you'd do something more about that than worrying about people consuming seed oils or having them in certain products. But look, that's what we're living in, and people think, oh, it's great, let's do something about this. This will make a difference.
Yeah. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out. I guess. Look, if they have a secret here, which is going to revolutionize my personal training and my coaching, where it's just a case of, oh well, people just need education and they just need to be told what to do, then if that's the kind of approach we're going to be going with on a population level, then I think we're going to be a bit lost. All right, so I'm not going to keep you here too much longer, Danny, because I know I've taken up plenty of your time, but I guess kind of going on the opposite kind of end from the fats with like seed oils, I guess. Do we still have a problem with sugar? Is sugar still a thing that we should be really look at? Because I know it's a question I always get from clients when they're kind of looking at their MyFitnessPal and like, Shane, my sugar intake is like in the red here. Like, should I be worried about this, or like how do you triage that type of situation?
So I think one of the things, the first delineation is between total sugars in the diet and added sugars. And so most of the recommendations of limits that we placed on the amount of sugar in the diet. So you've different numbers. It could be less than 10% of calories coming from added sugars. It could be less than 5%, some organizations recommend. But they're referring to added sugars. They're not referring to naturally occurring sugars that would be in things like fruit or the naturally occurring sugar in milk, for example. Yep. So being aware of that first and foremost. Secondly is that, again, when you look at most of the negative outcomes associated with excess sugar intake, it tends to be in the context of an excess calorie intake, in that there's obviously going to be a tight correlation there. And there could be something that when you're consuming a diet generally that's very high in added sugars, you're probably going to be over consuming calories. Or it could be a thing where if you have lots of products with more sugar, it's more likely you're going to consume more of them because it ties into the palatability and the enjoyment maybe we're getting from that. But without that calorie excess and without that accumulation of adipose tissue, it's very difficult to find direct studies where you see going slightly above or below that kind of threshold of sugar intake where it's causing an actual problem. That being said, it's probably still a good idea from a dietary pattern perspective that you're not having a huge amount of added sugars in the diet, simply because it's replacing other things that could be in the diet, right? So if you are only working with a certain number of calories that we want to stay within, because we want to avoid that calorie excess, then if you have a load of that made up by added sugar content that's not really contributing any other nutrients really, then you're missing out on other foods and other sources of nutrients that could be beneficial for your health. So I think that's probably the main thing. I don't think it's worth having a myopic view on trying to reduce sugar intake to zero or fearing that any sugar in any product is necessarily bad. Like and again, there's some kind of nuance that people need, because oftentimes there might be something useful like, oh, when you're in the supermarket, you can look when you're buying yogurts of saying this Greek yogurt versus this one has way more added sugar. That might be useful of, oh, well, I'll choose the plain Greek yogurt and maybe I'll add some berries myself or add some whey protein to it to flavor it. That's probably a better choice. But also being aware that if you look at any type of product in the supermarket, just because it has, let's say, oh, there's a gram of sugar in this, I need to find something with 0, might be a bit more of a myopic focus. So in general, again, it comes down to the overall dietary pattern and having some degree of common sense around that, knowing that, okay, probably not lots of things with huge amounts of added sugars, but it's not a thing where you need to reduce that to 0, and there's plenty of room for those things within an overall healthy dietary pattern, I think.
I think one thing that comes from the sugar, off the back of the sugar question, however, is people will learn a little bit about like a surface level of blood glucose and insulin. You know, there's plenty of social media shiftfluencers who are, you know, kind of pushing this narrative. Yet again, it's been around since I started learning about all this stuff like over 10 years ago, and it's probably around before then too. But you know, for the average person, like, you know, who's not diabetic, like, how worried should they even be about like something like thinking about their blood glucose or their insulin levels? Like, now you hear about people getting these CGMs that are continuous and they're non-diabetic. Like, is this all a waste of time, or like, you know, are we kind of going down a kind of wrong path here?
Yeah, it's in general, most of that use is going to be a misinterpretation of what those readings mean, particularly from like you say, some of the influencers that are there, whether it's probably Glucose Goddess is the most popular right now, most famous with her books and stuff, is basically a mass interpretation of what these numbers mean. And so you have people saying, oh, look, after I had this bowl of porridge, my blood sugar is now diabetic. It's like, no, after you had that bowl of porridge, your blood sugar went up as it normally should do into a range that would be diabetic for someone who did a fasting blood glucose measure. And that's a completely different measure to your postprandial measure 20 minutes after eating breakfast. And so understanding the differences between what those measures actually mean. In general, if someone is getting blood tests with their doctor every, say they're, however often they check in with them once a year, and they're getting their hemoglobin A1C and that's fine, and their fasting glucose is fine, then okay, that's good. If those things are not okay, then they're probably going to work with their doctor to find out what's going on. But I think for some of the mad things that you see now is you have people who are healthy, lean, really physically active, and they're getting a CGM and then worrying about having a certain type of fruit because their blood glucose went past a certain number that an influencer said was bad. And that's so far away from what is a normal glucose response, that we can have these spikes in glucose. And the problem, as long as it comes back down within a certain period of time, and we have to look at what those number of hours is and what that point returns to. But again, if you have a large bolus of carbohydrate and your blood sugar goes up quite a bit, that's probably normal. And if everything is working from in terms of if you're metabolically healthy, then insulin goes up, it brings that blood glucose back down, and a couple of hours later you're back to normal and all is good. You don't need to worry about that your blood glucose spiked. And I think there's very little to suggest that's potentially an issue. And so again, there are, of course, measures around glycemia that are important, whether that's fasting glucose, fasting insulin, postprandial glucose, like a oral glucose tolerance test that you can get done at a doctor and so on. Those things can give good insight. But if someone's just blindly going in with a CGM and using it and trying to use that to determine if for them a certain meal is good or bad, because there's so many things that are going to influence that measure, and you could have the same meal at the same time of day, and each day you're going to see a different response based on a whole ton of factors, right? Your sleep, your stress, what activity you did or didn't do, and then beyond that, knowing what an actual normal response is, people are getting lost because they're finding influencers saying your blood glucose should never go over a certain amount, and it's a relatively low number. It's like, that's not true. It can go up much further past that. as long as it comes back down. And so, yeah, there's again a situation where something sounds really cool, it sounds innovative, but is tied to a lot of problems, I think.
I think one thing that people get wooed by when they are following these people is it's the sciencey jargon and the overemphasis on mechanisms. So when you're talking about seed oils, you talked about like some of the mechanistic kind of rationale that people will try to push that narrative with. But then when you look at like the observational studies, things longer terms, like actual human outcome trials, like they seem to be like over extrapolations. And I think this kind of area seems to be like a similar one. People will talk about like what happens when you eat carbohydrates and how everything turns into sugar, and like why sugar, like then they go to the root of why sugar is bad and sugar increasing insulin. And it's funny how like you can talk to like people there, right, and they'll say sugar, right, sugar, insulin, boom, store fat. You talk to a bodybuilder and they're like, insulin, great, hook me up, right. It's gonna make me jacked. It's like there's obviously like that distinction there, but like maybe you'll be able to talk a little bit more to this, but like with the kind of rationale of like kind of insulin spiking and then insulin being the fat storage hormone, there has been like human outcome trials to kind of test this theory, right? So like the Carbohydrate-Insulin model of obesity, I think it was Kevin Hall. I can't remember what year it was, maybe 2019 or something like that. Can you remember the kind of details of that study?
Yeah, so Hall's group have done quite a few trials. I think one of the ones that on this was a metabolic ward study that they did, and basically taking this idea of through either carbohydrate restriction or fat restriction, when you control for calories, do we see any differences? And basically, in short, the answer is no. And in summary, again, to massively oversimplify what was incredible work, but basically, when you think of this, part of the problem with overly focusing on carbohydrate and insulin is that there's this focus on fat oxidation and saying, well, look, when you have insulin really low, through carbohydrate restriction, you get more fat oxidation, which again, colloquial people will call fat burning, which again thinks like, oh, well, that means I'm going to lose more body fat. That's not the case. This fat oxidation is what fuels are being used at that time point. So what the study nicely showed is that yes, with the carbohydrate restriction, you get more fat oxidation, but you are going to get less carbohydrate oxidation. So you're not going to be burning up as much carbohydrate, obviously, because you're not consuming that. With the other one, the very low fat intake and a high carbohydrate intake, you get the opposite effect. You don't get as much fat oxidation, but you're getting more carbohydrate oxidation. And the net effect that's going to impact your actual body fat stores is the overall energy balance, which is why we talk about calories. And so this is going to be when you take those things together, you are basically using up the same amount of energy. And so it's inconsequential whether that reduction in calories that someone has had is through reducing their carbohydrate or their fat intake. And so again, and this is replicated across a whole bunch of different types of studies of different links and so on, that in situations of calorie controlled and calorie matched conditions and protein matched conditions, varying the amount of carbohydrate and fat is basically inconsequential when it comes to fat loss. And this is I would struggle how someone can look at some of that work now and still contend that is not the case, because it's just pretty much been demonstrated multiple times now. And so that's kind of where we are with it. But I think, like you said, these things are very difficult to die. People always find a way to say that there's something wrong with these studies that contradict their view, and instead they will cite something that's far more anecdotal or poor quality. But that's what we end up having. And so like my favorite like I guess anecdote or example as I push back to that kind of narrative is like most like natural bodybuilders, will just take out the inclusion of like drugs here for a second, but most natural bodybuilders, like when they're going through their diet phases, they're prioritizing like having a lot of carbohydrates in the diet so they can perform well, and someone like the leanest, like most muscular people, like you'll see, you don't really have an issue with like using body fat in the context of a deficit and a high carbohydrate diet, right? So it's like
show me the bodies. Show me the bodies. Yeah. So I guess we've been chatting here for like the last hour and a half, and I guess anybody who has listened so far probably understands that there's a lot of complexity that goes into like what makes up like a healthy diet, and like there's more to it than just like the inclusion or like exclusion of like a certain food or food type, and we bring it all the way back to like the social element, the cultural factors, how it relates to like our emotional health and everything like that. So again, I think we've pretty much covered everything that there is to cover today anyway, because I know I've taken up plenty of your time here, Danny. So I guess like I gotta kind of bring this back to you, because I know you have a great question that you end your podcast with all the time. I'm not going to get you to answer your own. I'm not going to get you to answer your own question, because I'm sure you have that copyrighted at the moment. I guess like for anybody who's listening right now who wants to make some type of change towards their diet, like towards a healthy diet, what would you say is like the most like immediate thing that they should really be thinking about focusing on?
So I think it actually ties back to something we mentioned, and it's something that people can be part of this process. They don't need someone necessarily to give them the thing to do, in that right now, for anything, this goes even beyond nutrition, but diet is a good example that we can take stock and look at, okay, what do I typically do? So, and maybe if someone's thinks they know what they typically do but is unsure, there's a way to do this. Just spend a week just noting what is your normal day-to-day approach with your nutrition, not in terms of just what you eat, but when do you typically consume those meals? How do you go about preparing it? What types of ingredients do you have? What meals do you tend to default to or want to consume? And once you have an idea of that, you can then look at that as an overview and say, okay, of these, if I could only make one or two changes that might have some positive impact, if I were to do them over a long period of time, i.e. over years, what types of changes could that be that are relatively simple to put in place? So in other words, that those meals and your structure looks pretty much the same what you currently do, but is some of those changes. You gave your example earlier of, well, if I'm looking to increase the amount of fruits and vegetables, because that's part of these guidelines, but I know that my first meal of the day is only a protein shake, is that something that could have protein shake but with a couple of types of fruits blended in, right? There straight away, you haven't really changed the structure or the types of meals you're consuming or the difficulty in doing that, but you've made quite a significant change over a long period of time of the amount of fruits that you're going to be consuming. You could do that other parts of your other meals. There we are gone.
So sorry about that, man.
Oh, we're back. No worries at all, man. I know how things are with internet and technical issues. So
Spanish internet.
Sorry,
you did you finish off what you were saying there, or did you just stop in the middle?
No, I stopped, but I think I was
yeah, you're talking about
just in the middle of giving an example of
you're talking about the kind of small change, kind of like when you're talking about my example of like adding in the fruit into the smoothies. And
yeah, and then there's an infinite number of these depending on what someone's change might be. I can think of situations where, depending if someone's just getting new to making some of these changes, actually one of the close friend of mine who was coaching at Sigma before had a client who the main change they initially made was just switching the coffee that this guy was consuming. He would have, at the time, it was consuming maybe 5 or 6 across a work day because he was quite busy. And but these were, again, coffees that one of his staff members would bring back from Starbucks that were filled with all sorts of stuff, maybe had cream and sugar that to be added to them, ones that just taste nice. But he didn't really particularly care if they had them or not, just that's the way it was. So he's accumulating probably close to 1,000 calories across the day of these types of things. Making a change to that without anything else allowed a positive change in that diet. And so there's an infinite number of these examples where that's, okay, I typically make a pasta dish for dinner and I already have some type of protein source in there, but maybe I could do a few more vegetables, or maybe I can experiment with trying to add in some kidney beans to my rice dishes, or adding in some type of extra part of some vegetables in with this pasta dish. So basically everything is staying the same initially, but with a few additions that are likely to improve those. And then if you note that there's certain things that you are over consuming. So whether that is, let's say you like, okay, well, I'm finding I'm eating like, I don't know, red meat every single day. Maybe I want to try and make some changes here. What are some things I can maybe substitute that with and try and see how that works out in some of those same meals? So you end up having the same type of dinner, but you're maybe going to try and experiment with some things you maybe haven't done before. If someone wants to include, or maybe they've heard about, okay, I'm interested in adding in more plant-based sources of protein to see how I get on with that because I've never really done that. Maybe they can start saying, okay, well, let me see what the deal is with this tofu and how to maybe try and make it nice and see if it fits in with the types of meals I usually have and if it's easy to do. And then that might be just one change for that person to get going with. So there's a whole range of these, but it basically, the advice is to start out with taking stock of what you typically normally do. And of this, what would be the most simple change that doesn't change too much of the structure, but is actually going to make something that is more closer in line with some of those general principles of a healthy diet we mentioned earlier. That would probably be a good starting point. And then you can repeat that process as many times as you want afterwards.
Yeah, essentially going for the lowest hanging fruit, and it's, like that. That's the similar approach that I use when I'm kind of helping people with nutrition. It's just like, it's never a drastic overhaul. Like the drastic overhaul never really works for people. It's like you look at your diet logs, you see, okay, what's the easiest thing for you to change right now? What's going to have the most meaningful impact to change, like right now, that's going to be easiest, right? Like going for those big rocks, and then once you've got the big rocks turned over, you can worry about the lesser important stuff. And that's, I guess, when people start going towards the path of optimization. But I guess, do we ever reach like optimal diet?
Right. But I mean, it's the same. You can give these examples with someone that's training. Maybe they come to you and they're like, hey, look, I go to the gym 3 times a week. I don't have much time, so I'm only in there for like 40 minutes, and I can't do much more. There's no point in you saying, well, what you should be doing is a 5-day training split with this amount of volume and frequency, because based on the latest studies, you can get the best muscle growth with this, this, and this. Yeah. What you'd look at is like, okay, well, what are you doing in those 3 days you're there? And there's like, oh, well, I go in and I don't really have much structure. Okay, well, that's the first thing we can change. Or if you've only got half an hour to train, hey, you're spending 10 minutes here doing tricep kickbacks. Maybe in that time you could do something else. Maybe you could do like a bench press or an overhead press. It's like, that's probably going to be a much more better use of your time. That's a big change over a long period of time. But someone hasn't overhauled their whole life. They're still going to the gym for the same amount of time. They're still doing the same number of exercises. They've just made one little substitution. And then it's kind of the same idea. We're just applying to what someone is typically consuming in their diet. And that's probably going to work out better.
Danny, thank you very much for your time and all of the knowledge you've imparted and everybody who's listened to this. So, look, really appreciate having you on. But before we leave you off, would you be able to tell everybody where they can find more about you and learn more from you?
Sure. I suppose the website is sigmanutrition.com. If they want to listen to the podcast, it's just Sigma Nutrition Radio. It's on all podcast apps. And then they can find me on either Instagram, just put in my name, or on Twitter/X. I'm also on there. Not super active on much social media, but I'll be there and will respond to questions, etc. if people have them. But any of those places is probably best.
You have a course to push as well, don't you? Because I do have some coaches and everything that do listen to this.
For people who are interested in going in and learning about some of the details of interpreting those research studies, how to critique a nutrition study, how to understand some of those concepts better, Alan Flanagan and I developed a course called Applied Nutrition Literacy, which is basically aimed at that. So it's for people who have a good understanding of, I would say, of nutrition, but maybe want to take it to a point where they can go and read a study themselves and be confident in their interpretation of it. Or more so, if they see someone online, an influencer, saying, hey, this new study says, I don't know, seed oils are terrible, that you can now go and look at that study and critique it and say, well, actually, this is not what it says. And that's the idea, that people then can rely on their own understanding of some of that terminology and some of the unique aspects of nutrition science. So that's Applied Nutrition Literacy. We run a couple of cohorts each year. So depending on when this goes out, people can see when the next cohort is running. But more information is there. So there's information about that on the Sigma Nutrition website. And yeah, that's applied nutrition literacy might be of interest to people who want to upskill in their interpretation of nutrition studies.
Unreal. Thank you very much for your time, Danny. And people at home, if you've enjoyed the episode, go over, give Danny a follow, go and listen to the podcast and take a look at the course if that is something that is up your alley. And obviously, if you have enjoyed this podcast, make sure to leave me a rating and review on the podcast platform that you're listening on. And we will catch you in the next one.